Just to let you know, this is being recorded, so feel free to share this with your colleagues in the future. Just to explain, we have a number of corporate businesses in Ukraine Britain Business Council. In particular, one or two signed up today. Piraeus Bank, for example, Serco, DLC. We have Acro, we have Coventry University and Bath Spa University. And also I see Chesterfield's signing up. So hopefully everybody's coming on board here. Hogan Lovells, Deloitte should be here. And I think the British Embassy in Kyiv is logging on. So we'll just wait for everybody to appear. Okay, I think we might start for the moment. Slightly fewer people than we had signed up, but maybe people will all log on. So welcome to the Ukraine Britain Business Council's webinar on Ukraine. Where is Ukraine militarily and politically? We have two particularly interesting leading proponents and commentators speaking to us today. Professor Phillips O'Brien, who's head of the School of International Relations, Professor of Strategic Studies at St Andrews University, and Edward Lucas, who's a British writer and journalist on The Times, and he's a senior advisor, non-resident Centre for European Policy Analysis, specialising in European and transatlantic security. And I believe Edward also speaks about 5 languages, but today we'll be having it in English. So without more ado, there's a few questions I've posed to the speakers, and the key thing is just to let them speak about their current analysis of the situation, perhaps from a military and political standpoint. So without more ado, I'd very much like to introduce Professor Phillips O'Brien from St Andrews. Phillips, please take the floor. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ashley, and thanks for everyone for being here and organizing it. A military update on the state of the war probably has to go in a few layers, and I'll start with what we'll say the front line and the battlefield, and then move to, in many ways, the more dynamic one, which is the strategic air war that's going on, and then the geopolitical war. The war at the front, the war in the Donbass, or the war, the recent Russian incursion around Sumy, is in many ways in a pattern that it's been going on for months. And that is, there's very little chance of a major breakthrough of any kind. The war is going to go like that. What we are seeing is the Russians making incremental advances and just taking small amounts of territory in a way that's quite difficult to stop because they don't care about casualties. So they have a sort of an offensive pattern based around troops rushing forward, being protected by UAVs, often these fiber optic UAVs, which can't be jammed, rushing forward into a small area, taking that area and just holding on. And that's been going on now for a while. The advance, by the way, the pace of advance is still historically very, very slow. I think we have to put the kind of advances that we're seeing from the Russians in perspective. Last year, they took less than 1% of Ukrainian territory. This year, it's on a slower pace than it was last year. So, it's the Russians are indeed making advances, but they are very small amounts of territory, and they are suffering very large casualties to take those kind of advances. The issue the Ukrainian military has is, one, it needs to really protect its soldiers' lives now. That you might say that the real issue the Ukrainians have is a smaller population than the Russians and a willingness not to sacrifice their population. So the Ukrainians can't keep a lot of soldiers, say, on the front lines where they can be hit by these Russian advances, but that means they are going to give up territory. So the Ukrainians have to keep their casualties down as much as possible, and have a defense which as horrible as it sounds, you might say bleeds the Russians white. I think that's sort of the Ukrainian strategy. It's hard to see that basic frontline dynamic change in the coming months. I think what we're going to see is more of what we have been seeing over the last few months of the Russians making these very small advances. They're clearly trying to take as much of the Donbass as they possibly can. The attack against Sumy is never going to be enough to take Sumy. It's more probably to try and make Sumy an unlivable city by bringing it between massed sort of heavy artillery ranges. But it's, the war is what the war is right now in the front line, and it's hard to see it changing. I don't think you're going to see, in other words, a mass breakthrough. When people talk about a breakthrough, it's almost impossible to do in this war, because you can't have vehicles survive on roads for very long. You can't get supplies forward. There's tanks can't survive. The one vehicle you actually seem to be able to make some advances with now is the motorcycle, because it's small and light, and you run it ahead a few hundred yards, and the person there may or may not die, but at least they can get a few hundred yards before they're stopped. And so, the front line will be what it is. In many ways, I think actually the real center of gravity of the war is for both the Ukrainians and the Russians moving a bit to the strategic air war. The Russians cannot defeat Ukraine in the battle. The battlefield victory in the traditional way, I think, is going to be almost impossible for the Russians to do because of the issues I've talked about. So what seems to be, and by the way, it's going to be very difficult for the Ukrainians to do anything right now about driving the Russians back. I don't think that's technologically capable with the forces the Ukrainians have and the kind of technology they've been given. So in many ways, the real interesting, more dynamic part of the war, the focus of the war, will be in this strategic air war, which is getting, by the way, a lot more production than people understand. I mean, where both Ukrainian and Russian production is often going, a lot of it is going actually to bombard each other at range. The Ukrainians, I don't probably have to tell this crowd, have a massive internal drone production system and are actually about to supposedly mass produce their own cruise missiles and ballistic missiles. To that, the Russians have been putting huge efforts into rebuilding their missile stocks. They're making massive numbers of these Shahed drones. They got the plans from the Iranians, but they have significantly upgraded those plans so that Russian Shaheds are probably a generation beyond the Iranian Shaheds they first got. Now, how the war seems to be developing in the air war, and which could be quite crucial. The Russian strategy seems to be ultimately to drive the Ukrainian population to accept a bad deal. I think the air war that we're seeing and the attacks on the Ukrainian cities is an attempt to break the will of the Ukrainian population, or at least provide such weakness within the Ukrainian political system that the Ukrainian government will say, okay, we will accept a bad deal. And I think you're going to see more of the attacks on Ukrainian cities because of that. That just seems to be a focus of what the Russians are going to do. And if you look at what they're making, there will be more Shaheds, more missiles, and so there will be attacks on Ukrainian cities that are going on. The Ukrainians, on the other hand, are building up their own range forces. They are not attacking Russian cities. They are aiming for Russian production, Russian logistics, and Russian military capabilities. That is going to go up hugely, because one of the ways to protect Ukrainian cities is going to be to try to destroy the Russian ability to attack those cities. So the Ukrainians are going to go against the Shahed production. They're going to go against the bases from which the Russians are launching their missiles, the different platforms. And so the Ukrainian, and we don't know, this war is in many ways going to be, that's going to be the battle of the summer, is this struggle over the long-range attacks between either side. And if one side can gain a decisive battle in that, or a decisive advantage in that, I think it will make a very big difference in the war. So watch we won't know them, but watch the production and where it's going and what it's attacking, and you'll have a pretty good idea. Now, from a geopolitical point of view, what I'll say, talk about supporting Ukraine. I'm not going to talk about Russia so much. And it works into this ranged war. The thing that I'm sure Edward has heard me that frustrates me is that right now we have to assume the U.S. is out of the game. That it's not a case of will the U.S. help Ukraine? It's not going to help Ukraine. All right, it's that what we have now is the dregs of the Biden aid coming through. There is no new aid that has been approved by Congress, and President Trump has not asked for any aid. So this will matter in this ranged war when it comes to protecting cities, because one thing that really has to happen is the Ukrainians need as much anti-air support as they can possibly get. That's going to have to come from Europe because it's not going to come from the United States. So geopolitically, you have to look at this. The United States is mostly out of the game and not going to be providing a great deal of assistance. So ultimately, Ukraine's outside aid is now going to be down to Europe. And I think that has to be understood, that Europe has to step up here. Certain European countries are, certain European countries are not. But Ukraine's aid, if it's going to come to keep it going in this war and fighting effectively, will come from Europe. And I think we have to assume that's the way forward. So there's a few minutes of update. That's about 10 minutes. So I'll end it there.
Thank you very much, Phillips. That was really interesting and possibly somewhat more optimistic than one might be led to believe. Edward, look forward to hearing to your view of things. And obviously with a slightly more Russian head on, I'd be interested to see what you think about the war from that perspective.
Well, thanks so much, Ashley, and also to Emma for organising this. And it's a privilege and an honour to speak to the people who are keeping Ukrainian business going. You're not just defending your own country, you're defending the security and freedom of all of Europe, and you don't get thanked enough for that. I think that it's always a good idea to see how the world looks from your opponent's point of view. And one of the big problems in the way we've looked at Russia really over the last 30-something years has been through the lens of wishful thinking. We want Russia to be friendly, and so we assume it will be. And we want Russia to be weak now because we're kind of at war with Russia, and we assume it will be. And this bad analysis leads us into bad policy. And we've paid a bit of a price for this, the West, but by far the biggest price for the West's mistakes has been paid by the Ukrainians. And I think anyone who's been involved in Western policymaking over the last 30 years should approach the catastrophe that we're in at the moment with a degree of contrition. And I'm afraid I don't hear that as often as perhaps we should. How does the world look from Putin's point of view? Well, it's not too bad at the moment, actually. The Russian economy has weathered the sanctions. The sanctions made quite a dent at the beginning. But in the end, we were not willing, particularly in the United States, to accept the risk of high oil prices. In Europe, we weren't willing to accept the risk to the euro and to the reputation of our financial system of seizing the frozen Russian assets. So in the end, we did what we felt we could, but not actually what we knew we must. And so when Putin looks at the West's ability to inflict economic pain on Russia, he doesn't feel this is daunting. He doesn't feel I'm living on borrowed time. Yes, there have been some problems. He's mortgaging Russia's long-term future, but you could argue that that's been going on for decades or even longer. But he's not in trouble this year. He may be in a bit more trouble next year as the so-called rainy day fund runs out. There's about 30 billion left in that, but he still has plenty of policy levers to pull. He can go after rich people and shake them down for money. He can force the Russian population to accept low living standards. There's always the possibility of more help from China, often as a result of transactions that are in the long run not very good for Russia. But that's tomorrow's problem, and Putin's priority is to survive for today. So I don't think he's under great economic stress. Second big bit of wishful thinking is the idea that there is some kind of Russian opposition. And although there have been charismatic and prominent personalities in the past, Nemtsov and Navalny, to name two, there is only one real Russian opposition, and that is the armed forces of Ukraine. And any talk to the contrary is, I'm afraid, just wishful thinking and pernicious wishful thinking. Putin does not face any kind of grassroots domestic challenge, nor do I think at the moment is there any sign of the regime splitting. There are all sorts of fanciful ideas of some kind of putsch, sort of death of Stalin scenario where some mythical insider clique gets together and boots the boss upstairs or out of the window or into the basement or whatever metaphor you like. I just don't see that happening. It might happen if Russia was losing really badly, but Russia's not losing really badly. And until Ukraine is given the money and the weapons that it needs, Russia isn't going to be losing really badly. I completely agree with Phillips that the progress has been very slow and the cost has been huge, but Russia is a huge country and the idea of accepting suffering is pretty much baked in. And if anyone complains, you're told, just look what your grandparents did during the siege of Leningrad. We are fighting Nazis again, so be proud and don't complain. My final point, I think, is that we are in a really unfavorable geopolitical environment, not just Ukrainians, but the West generally. And that's for two reasons. First of all, Russia is at war with Europe, and most of Europe has yet to realize it. And we don't have the alliance cohesion we need, and we don't have the threat perception that we need, we don't have the defense that we need, and we don't have the deterrence that we need. And on all of those four axes, there's a lot of catching up to do. And although we are heading in the right direction, in the short run, that makes it more dangerous rather than less, because as I asked our Defence Secretary, John Healey, this week, why would Putin wait until we're ready? It looks as though in about 10 years' time, Europe might get into pretty good shape, given an orderly and constructive American withdrawal. But Europe's plenty big enough and rich enough to look after itself, and you can easily imagine 5 to 10 years, Europe having a sort of strong, capable defence, deterrence, a common threat picture, and the kind of united decision-making needed for that all to work. But we're not there yet, and so my big worry is not what happens in 5 years, but what happens in 5 months. And I think there's a possibility, which we don't spend enough time on, that Putin cashes in his chips in Ukraine and says, okay, here's a ceasefire, we're just going to stop fighting. The Ukrainians are told to suck that up by the West, particularly by Trump, and I'll get onto that in a moment. And we then get a kind of dirty, unpoliced ceasefire where Russia remains on the front foot, has the initiative to come back for second helpings in Ukraine whenever it wants, can false flag its way to a breakdown of the ceasefire, circumstances in which Ukrainians get blamed, or they pivot and try something else in some other part of Europe where we are profoundly unready. And my final point about is that we, as Philip said, we are in a post-Atlantic security order. President Trump wants to be friends with Putin. He doesn't like Zelensky. He will pay lip service to the idea of being an impartial peacemaker, which in itself is horrific, given the idea that this is being a peacemaker between a perpetrator and a victim. But I'm more worried that it's going to be worse than that, that Trump actually would like to be friends with Putin, and he may force Europe to choose. Do you go with Ukraine or do you go with the United States? And that would be an extremely difficult choice for Europe. So I fear that we in Europe are heading towards a collision with the United States that we can neither survive nor avoid. And I worry a lot about that. In a way, Ukraine, with its immensely competent, capable army, its rapidly developing defense sector, pretty cohesive population, all they really need is the money to keep going. And they can do that if we help them. But the position for the rest of us, I think, is actually in a way even worse. We'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Edward. That's quite a group of thoughts there, and a worrying one. But I would just say, if, for example, Phillips says that Russia really hasn't made much progress at all in 2 years, why would Putin suddenly start to attack Europe? He may find himself having another front that is even less digestible. So I don't quite understand.
I think let me elaborate a bit. I don't think Putin is going to launch a large-scale attack on Europe. He can't do that. But I do think that while Europe is weak and divided, he could test NATO. So a small and very confusing land grab, whether it was in the Baltic states or possibly one of the Norwegian island of archipelago of Svalbard. But what would be very convenient for Putin would be some kind of stunt where the threat perceptions in Europe, or perceptions of what's happened in Europe, vary very sharply. So the country concerned, maybe Lithuania, says, wow, this is Article 5, help, we need to go to war right now. We need to immediately start by flattening Kaliningrad and closing down the Russian air defences in Kaliningrad. And the rest of Europe goes, whoa, wait, no, hang on. We don't see this as Article 5. This isn't worth getting. Let's see if we can negotiate. And if you get something which the country concerned thinks is an existential armed attack, and the rest of Europe doesn't react, then NATO's broken. And we're then in a post-NATO environment. And the risk of that for Putin's quite small. If it all goes wrong, he can pull back again. He can say, okay, we sent our combat engineers to Svalbard because the Russian miners there, their generators had broken down and the Norwegians weren't fixing them. And good, we've now discovered the generators are working again, so we're taking our people back again. So he can test NATO, and the downside for him is quite low. It doesn't, if it turns out that NATO is working, well, that's what most people thought anyway. If it turns out that NATO doesn't work, that's a big win for him. So there's an asymmetric risk calculus for Putin in testing NATO. He's not getting very far in Ukraine. So that's why I think that he may decide at this stage to, at some point, perhaps after the summer offensive, to declare a unilateral sort of what I call dirty truce, and then try something else. It's also worth noting, I think, that if he does declare a ceasefire of truce in Ukraine, Russia's military readiness continues to increase. I'm not sure that Ukraine's will, because many Ukrainian soldiers are desperate to go home. And if you had a post-ceasefire Ukraine, you'd have all sorts of buried internal political, social, regional, other tensions. A lot of people saying, well, now the war's over, we need to pay attention to this. So Russia, I think, would keep focus, and Ukraine might find it quite hard to keep its focus. This is speculation. I'm not saying it's going to happen, but it's something I worry about, and we should always, with Putin, expect the unexpected.
We should always be on our mettle. I agree. Phillips, do you think NATO is all effectively dead anyway?
I mean, I've been banging the drum about that. I think it's been dead for since Trump was the nominee for the Republican Party, if he won. I mean, I think the Europeans should have assumed it was a dead letter at that point. Trump has no interest in fighting for Europe. None. If Russia invaded now, not that it could, I don't think Trump would actually spend U.S. forces to defend Europe. I don't think the U.S. nuclear umbrella exists anymore. I certainly don't think the United States would fire nuclear weapons to protect a single European country. My real worry, to sound terribly pessimistic, is that actually Trump is stringing along European states in Russian interest by making them desperate to hope NATO has a future, and using that hope against Europe actually getting together, so that the U.S. is slightly throwing roadblocks into a proper refresh of what Europe is, or maybe a complete reimagining of European defense, because I think it has to be reimagined without the United States entirely. And right now, the United States is actually making that difficult for doing it. So it could be argued not only does NATO not exist, NATO is actually a problem in Europe imagining itself.
Well, I agree with Phillips, not for the first time. I think we have to, if we're very lucky, we get an orderly American withdrawal from Europe. I think it's much more likely that we get a transatlantic row where European security is a bargaining chip for the United States. and they actively either threaten to or indeed actively undermine our security in order to get other things. And it's nice to me being on call with Phillips. So I'm normally the gloomiest person on the call. I now have someone who's as gloomy as me.
Thank you. Could I ratchet it up further, in Phillips, and say, why are MAGA so apparently pro-Russian?
Well, I mean, there's a whole lot of layers there, but I'm going to start with the basic one. It's because Trump is. I mean, MAGA is something, but it's also partly simply the amplification of Trump's thoughts or Trump's self-interest. I mean, he has created MAGA from a lot of resentments that didn't have coherence. And he has enormous influence over the movement. We can see that by looking actually at opinion polling on Republican voters and Ukraine in the past 2 years. When the Russians launched their first launched the full-scale invasion in February 2022, Republicans and Democrats were almost identical in their reaction to the invasion. That Republicans were very strongly pro-Ukraine and showed hostility to the Russians. Trump, I would say, almost single-handedly changed that dynamic in the Republican Party. And he has gone on and basically said, Putin's my friend. We should be even-handed. He has given a lot of credence to the idea that it was NATO expansion that provoked Putin into the invasion. And this was him doing it. I mean, it wasn't anyone else. No one else in the Republican Party has the kind of hold over the party's imagination that he does. So partly it's not MAGA, it's Trump. And the MAGA wing of the Republican Party does what he wants. Now, there are certain contributing factors within the party that he can take advantage of. The evangelical Christian one, which is for some reason views Russia as compatriots, which makes very little sense, but they have this notion that Russia is a bastion of Western civilization. So that's one. There's a lot of money, Russian money, that is flooding around different MAGA types and influencers. The Russian government has done an extremely effective job in funding a lot of the people who create the narrative in MAGA, from Tucker Carlson to the others. So they've done a very good information warfare job. But it's more, I think, that kind of thing than any ideology. It's Trump, and it's playing off the influencers. But it has worked. It can't be denied that the MAGA, if we call it, or the Trump wing of the Republican Party, has you might say, at best, a neutralist view of this war. But I would say Trump, of course, has a significantly pro-Russian outlook or pro-Putin outlook.
Thank you. Just to switch it a little bit away from America for the moment. I mean, recently you've seen the spider's web attack on Russian wing. Is it likely that Ukraine are going to pull a few cats out the bag? And maybe that's part of your air warfare, which is possibly going rather well on the Ukraine side. And what would Ukraine need to do to make themselves very indigestible to Russia?
Well, I mean, what they need to do is just make the Russians lose. The Russians have lost about 1 million soldiers, and they are running out of vehicles. So I think, it's continuing the wastage of the armed forces, so that the land taken is really very small compared to the resources that are expended. I don't know if we'll see something like spiderweb, but the Russians have decided, they seem to have decided to say prioritize an air defense, the land battle. So most Russian air defense seems to be focused actually in occupied Ukraine or just over the border in Russia and around Moscow and St. Petersburg. That's where Russian air defense seems to be mostly concentrated. That means that much of the rest of the country is shockingly easy to attack if you can actually get the missiles or the drones there. So the Ukrainians are undoubtedly trying to think of other ways to attack areas of Russia that are not terribly well defended in air defense. I mean, the thing that really comes out of spiderweb was how poorly defended these crucial facilities were. So will it be something like spiderweb? Gosh knows. But will there be other attempts to take advantage of weak Russian air defense at critical targets? Almost certainly there will be, particularly as the Ukrainian production of missiles ramps up and UAVs. It's going to get now. I mean, the other thing, I mean, the negative one is I think Ukrainian cities, because partly the United States is starving Ukraine of air defense. Ukrainian cities are going to be hit very hard this summer. It's going to be a pretty ugly war.
Edward, do you want to put something in there, or are you happy to?
Yes, I agree with that. I think that it's actually Ukraine's biggest strategic problem is the lack of air defences, or the Russians' ability to saturate air defences in the big cities, and we are not able at the moment to substitute for the American Patriot systems. And Trump, so far, appears unwilling. Not only will he not donate Patriot systems, he won't even sell Patriot systems, and that's a strategic problem for Ukraine. They could counter this if they can develop very quickly large numbers of long-range fires that hit Russian cities, because there seems to be a bit of a de facto truce on both sides of hitting energy infrastructure. The Ukrainians haven't hit any more oil refineries recently, and the Russians haven't been hitting Ukrainian power stations recently. So I think that may be a bit of a, they've seen that that's mutual assured destruction, at least on that front, doesn't suit either side. If the Ukrainians can really hammer Russian cities, then that may stop the Russians hammering Ukrainian cities, because actually Russian air defences aren't that great either. But the Russians have the ability to build large numbers of long-range drones and then follow them up with these Oreshnik ballistic missiles, which can do a lot of damage, and the Ukrainians don't. But I think that the overall point is that the Europeans are beginning to realise what the world looks like if Ukraine loses. And that's absolutely catastrophic for them. You're talking millions of refugees, Russia absolutely on the front foot, the complete capsizing of the European security order. And I go to Brussels a lot. I have a meeting in European Commission, also NATO, talking to governments in the Nordic and Baltic countries, and now also Germany. And I think there's a new sense of seriousness that we can't rely on the Americans. We've got to do this ourselves. It is going to be expensive, but it's tiny. The cost is absolutely tiny compared with the cost if Ukraine breaks. And I think that's now dawning. It's obviously belated. I wish it had come earlier. But I'm reasonably optimistic now that Europe's waking up.
Thank you. So it seems to me we've got a mixture of a sort of First World War trenches meets sci-fi drone warfare. I mean, a sort of stalemate. Do you see that as a kind of, how long can this go on for?
That's for Phillips.
Yeah, I mean, I think both sides could probably only fight one, maybe to the end of 2026 on the front line in the present situation, simply because there won't be any vehicles left. I mean, we would in a very weird situation where you'll basically just have drones and people on foot and artillery. I personally don't think the war in that sense could go on beyond 2026 there without a ceasefire. The issue that Ukraine faces right now is it has to keep casualties down. I mean, it can't getting to an exchange of 1 or even 2 to 1 now with Russian forces. They've got to keep their casualties far down and inflict some damage, and that will require trading some of small parcels of territory for that. But it is like the First World. It isn't the differences between the First World War are the drones have actually made it far more transparent. So what we are dealing with on the front lines is a transparent battlefield. That once you come out and you come out on foot or come out on a motorcycle, whatever, you will be spotted very soon. And someone can get fire on you very soon. And that's only going to get worse as the amount of drones built increases. I mean, that's where people are putting their effort. No one's actually building tanks that much these days. They're building drones. On the other hand, the air war is anything but First World War. The strategic air war we're getting is going to be more like I would say the Russians are going to be more like what happened in the attacks on the cities in the Second World War. When what they're doing is very similar to what was done in the city attacks in the Second World War, and it will be pretty terrible.
Yes, and I do think it's worth underlining how far behind the rest of Europe is. I mean, to use an analogy of previous age, we're still in the world of cavalry, and the Ukrainians are fighting with tanks and planes. This is just generational change. The combination of the sensor shooter loop, the ability to get information and process it in a really decentralized way is just light years ahead of what any European military can do. And some countries are catching up faster than others. So, to highlight the Baltic states are good at this, and the Finns are thinking about it very hard. But we are light years behind where we need to be. And this is something that worries me, again, getting back to where if Russia was to attack other countries in NATO, Russia against Ukraine is kind of peer adversaries with the sort of nuances that we've discussed. I really wonder how any Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Finland, Sweden, Norway, or Britain would deal with the sort of attacks that the sort of battlefield tactics that the Ukrainians are dealing with. We are behind on this. So I think there's that's another sort of contribution to the tempo, and the increasing tempo, is the realization that Russia's actually surprisingly good at innovating. And that is actually not what we expected at the beginning of the war. People were saying the Russian military is basically useless, it's hierarchical, corrupt, rigid, any adjective you like. And we saw these kind of duck shoot massacres of the armored columns trying to get to Kiev, and we mocked them. And that was a really stupid thing to do, because actually, although the Ukrainians have done fantastic well in innovating, and we sort of expect that because they're the good guys, the Russians have done fantastic well in innovating too. And that was something that none of our defense intelligence people expected to see.
I want to be a little more optimistic than Edward on this. I think we actually overstated Russian innovation. I mean, the Russians have lost 1 million soldiers. So innovation within a framework of actually quite a plodding military. It's a military that can suffer 1 million soldiers because the society will allow it. But I think we've partly overstayed. I mean, what they have done is they've found ways to slaughter their own soldiers for very small gains and make very small gains. So if any of this happened in any other modern military, it wouldn't be called innovation. It would be called sort of something lower than that. The reason I say that, the situation's not good, is this is a beatable military. This is not a flexible, adaptive, creative military. This is actually still pretty hierarchical, pretty basic in its training. These soldiers are not trained well. They're given very direct orders, in many ways told they'll be shot if they turn around, and they make very small gains. And what we have done is, unfortunately, mostly forced the Ukrainians to this point to fight it head on. That's been the great tragedy of Western aid, is Western aid has been given in such a way that the Ukrainians had to fight this military at its strongest point, which is right at the face. But it is, I think, a beatable military.
Well, I do agree with that.
Yeah,
I think, I mean, I'm wonderful to have even a note of minor disagreement with Phillips, but I certainly agree it's beatable, and I certainly agree that it takes it wastes men and materiel in ways that no Western military would tolerate, and gets quite little in exchange. But I still think that the ability to do drone war, and if we had said 3 years ago that they would be manufacturing drones that are far more advanced than the Iranians, that they'd have nailed the fiber optic, 40 kilometers long fiber optic cables going behind the drones on fishing spools, that they would be organizing these kind of sci-fi hunting expeditions to Ukrainian cities to shoot civilians on the street. I think we'd have said that that would be a big jump for them. They did. I also think that we've underestimated historically Russia's ability to innovate in the sub-threshold space, and we are constantly on the back foot when it comes to Russian attacks on the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of our data in the so-called cyberspace. We're constantly on the back foot when it comes to Russian attacks on our critical infrastructure. We don't really have an answer to Russian targeted attacks on individuals using criminals hard over messaging apps and paid in Bitcoin. So on all that sort of great so-called grey zone, Russia has innovated pretty effectively, and I don't feel that either in defence or in deterrence, Western countries have caught up. I would say the Ukrainians are ahead, but possibly some of the Baltic states have done pretty well. And Finland's very good, certainly when it comes to in-depth defence and resilience. But I would say that Russians are a couple of laps ahead of the rest of Europe in the sub-threshold space, and that also counts as innovation.
Hugely agree. I mean, the Russian great success has been its ability to pervert the U.S. and European political systems. It's an extraordinary thing that they've done. They have basically, pro-Putin leaders in charge of Hungary, Slovakia, and the United States. They almost took Romania. There's a question now, about Poland. We don't know what's going to happen in France, but the ability of the Russian state to take advantage of weaknesses in political weaknesses in Europe and the United States is very impressive and terrifying. And they've had the #1 victory of this war is Donald Trump becoming president. That is the single most geopolitical important development, and
Absolutely.
They did that.
And we used to talk about Schröderization, the capture, the elite capture of bits of the German Social Democrats, exemplified by the close personal relationship between Gerhard Schröder and Vladimir Putin. I think the Trumpification of America is far, far worse than the Schröderization of Germany.
Right.
We do weddings and bar mitzvahs as well, by the
way. Roll on the horror show. I mean, the worry is that Russia is sort of match fit. It's caught up, it's got more lithe, it's got more innovative. So Europe really does have to be wary now. Phillips, you suggested...
No, Europe's issue, though, Europe's issue is political and social. Europe has the money, it has the technology. The problem is it just hasn't used it. Had Europe started 2 years ago doing what it should have done, it would be in a very far more advantageous position. The problem Europe had is it simply does not have a strategic mindset of its own. It does not want to think for itself. It wants to rely on the United States. It wants to, in fact, outsource its strategic thinking. And because of that, it's put off these decisions that were staring it in the face.
Funnily enough, that was very much what they told the Europeans quite recently, wasn't it? I mean, in a way, America's saying, wake up, smell the coffee, get real. And actually, maybe they're doing Europe a favor in that sense.
Yes, they don't actually really mean that, though, by the way.
Okay.
Yeah. I think, the last thing the Americans want is the Europeans to develop their own arms industry and to stop buying American weapons. So basically what the Americans want is the Europeans to spend a little bit more, but to buy US stuff.
And this is such an important point. I was looking at the history of the Atlantic Alliance, and right from the get-go, the Americans were saying, hang on, shouldn't the Europeans be doing more? Actually, when the treaty, the NATO treaty, went through the Senate, the senators were saying, hang on, why are we on the hook for the Europeans? They're rich. And that was even in late 1940s. And we had Eisenhower pushing the Europeans to do more, and every president since then. And whenever the Europeans have done more, the Americans have said, hang on, not like that. So there's always been this idea, you don't want an autonomous Europe, we don't want a sovereign Europe, blah, blah, blah. Don't want a European pillar of NATO. Just buy our weapons, do what you're told, pay when we say, but don't have a mind of your own. That genie is now out of the bottle. You've now got Europeans saying we will never trust the Americans again. This isn't about Trump. This is forever. There's that Dutch, I think it was a Dutch politician said, America, you're not my girlfriend anymore. Or I think it was she. So she said, America, you're not my boyfriend anymore. And so there's a real hunt is on. It can't happen immediately, but to build a European military supply chain. I'm working on this rearmament bank, European rearmament bank idea. And one of the strongest selling points for this is it's a defense finance instrument that will finance European defense production, not Americans. And there's a big argument about it, whether it'll even finance any purchases at all of American weapons, because for some of the potential shareholding countries, that's a no-no. And that's an absolute game changer. And so I really wonder if the MAGA crowd have understood that they've what they've created.
Great point. So there was a sense, Phillips, that maybe we've got another year of this grinding war unless something happens. It might peter out. They might just all get tired of it. The internal scenarios in each country, in Russia, suggesting it's pretty solid. The elites, the oligarchs, happy they're being paid off with war work. In terms of Zelensky and the Ukrainians, are they solid? And the Europeans, the geopolitical you talked about being the key issue. What's happening behind the scenes? Is the internal political dynamics the key thing we got to watch?
Well, I mean, I'm not an internal Russian or Ukrainian expert, so I don't want to say about the Ukrainian one. I think, what the Trump administration wants is the Russians to batter Ukrainian public opinion into such a degree that they'll take a bad deal. And the bad deal that is basically, actually, Witkoff outlined the bad deal, and it was quite clear. It was the 4 annexed provinces, illegally annexed provinces, all handed over to Russia. Crimea to be legally transferred or legally recognized by the United States as Russian territory, which I think would be ominous. The relaxation of sanctions on Russia, as Trump says, getting back to business, and no security guarantees for Ukraine. So that seems to be the deal that the United States, this administration, would like to force Ukraine to take. Now, Ukraine obviously doesn't want to take that deal and is fighting. The nightmare scenario, I suppose, is that the United States, and Edward mentioned this possibility, says to European states, you got to force Ukraine to do this, cut them off, or we're gone, and European states panic and do cut Ukraine off. Hopefully that won't happen. But you could have a lot of pressure being put on Ukraine from Europe if it does to take a bad deal. And then you have to tell me what the Ukrainian society and politics would do. I don't know what they would do if Europe sort of said to them, you must take this deal.
Edward, any thoughts on the internal machinations of the countries involved?
Well, I think that there's I agree that the danger is of a bad deal, and then the question of what does Putin do next? Does he come back for second helpings in Ukraine, or does he try something else? There's a good question on the chat from Ihor, which I think is worth answering, which is about the latent pro-Russian lobby in the West. And I noticed this a lot. I mean, they shut up good and hard after the full-scale invasion, and for about a year, you just didn't really hear anybody complaining. But it's really creeping back now. And there was a letter in the British newspaper, The Guardian, signed by a number of people, a former British ambassador to Moscow, Anatole Lieven of the Quincy Institute, various other, Professor Richard Sackwer, Lord Skidelsky and others, saying Russia's not a threat to the UK and we need to engage with Russia. And we may not like what the Russians do, but we have to talk to them. And I get this a lot now. There's this sort of what I call fashionable contrarianism, where people say, yeah, I know Russia's very bad, but what's next? Give me a new idea. And that hankering for a new policy, a new approach, is very deeply baked into the Western mindset. And particularly when you get new governments coming in, they always say, well, the previous government screwed up. We have bad relations with Russia. So let me see if I can do something and fix it. Now, we're not there yet. This is still, I think, in opposition rather than in government. But I did notice in the German Social Democrats, there was a very alarming piece by some of the more left-wing members saying we need a new peace order in Europe, not a security order, and we have to talk to the Russians. So I think it's still there. We haven't exorcised these ghosts yet, and given half a chance, they'll be back. Now, some of these people are just useful idiots. Some of them are actually on the Russian payroll. But you can bet your bottom dollar, perhaps bottom euro now that we don't like the dollar anymore, that there are people, whether they're in Yasenevo or the Aquarium or the Kremlin or wherever, who are thinking about how to activate networks of influence and agents of influence in particularly European countries in order to try and reset things with Russia. We don't spend nearly enough time thinking about how to wage political warfare against Russia and its allies. They spend a lot of time thinking about this, and they work, I wouldn't say 7 days a week, but probably 6, and quite long hours. And I'm worried about what they may have up their sleeve.
I mean, we have to face facts that the largest or second largest party in opinion polling terms in the United Kingdom, France, Germany, are basically pro-Russian or sympathetic to the Russians now. The AfD has been the fastest, the largest party in German polling. Reform is now the largest party in British polling. The Front National is the first or second largest party in French polling. There is sadly a reservoir of political parties, large political parties that I think would be quite happy to make a deal with Putin. They so far have not seized power anywhere, but they've not out in the large Western European countries. But I think that's the great thing that Putin's playing for in his mind, is to split Western Europe away from the countries that are, I think, frontline states who really are worried about Russia, the Nordics and the Baltics and Poland, Romania, Czech, and to divide them between Western European states, which they can take over one with a pro-Russian party, and then European unity is basically done.
Yes,
Okay.
I think it is bad, but I think that the European Union's shown a lot of resilience, actually, in dealing with Hungary, and I noticed that Slovakia didn't support Hungary on the when it came to the latest vote in the European Union. And I also think we need to thank Donald Trump, because he's made life very difficult for this. The AfD, the German party, sort of defines itself by anti-Americanism, and yet they now have an American president who's basically on their side, and this is causing some very enjoyable conniptions. But I have to go in a moment. So I want to say I'm so grateful to you for hosting this, and I've really enjoyed it. And perhaps if we've got time for one final question, I could have a stab at answering it.
Well, it's thank you, Ed. It's such an interesting question. We do have to finish in a minute. Just in terms of business, I mean, obviously, the British business is relatively reticent to go in to an uncertain situation. But do you have any advice to them in terms of going into Ukraine, working there, engaging with them? Obviously, defense is a good area, but if you got any succor you can give British business, be good to hear it.
Edward, are you there?
Oh, he's coming back in. Hello.
I mean, I'm not a business. I'll start off till Edward gets back. I mean, right now, the big thing is, of course, the innovation cycle in Ukraine is extraordinarily fast compared to businesses in the rest of Europe. When it comes to Ukrainian production and technology, the ability to integrate new technologies from the conception stage to actual production is months, whereas in most places in Europe, that's still, we're talking about years. So, UAV construction is just one of them. But, often UAVs have a 2-month innovation cycle, and then everything you thought was cutting edge is no longer cutting edge. So I would think that's the thing to take from cooperating with the Ukrainians and doing business, is to understand the nimbleness and flexibility of that.
And I completely agree with that. And I think the absolutely vital thing, if I could do one thing, it would make life easier for Ukrainian companies to get access to the financial system in the West. And I keep on, I'm right now dealing with a Ukrainian company that has got an extremely innovative product in the defense field, and they can't open a British bank account because the British banks go, how long have you been going? Oh, 9 whole months. When did you invent this product? 6 months ago. What does it do? Kills people in large numbers. And that just isn't in the sort of comfort zone of your average British bank. So we need to be a lot better at helping these extremely innovative and potentially really important defense tech companies get access. And we also need to find them loan finance, because a lot of them are living on venture capital, which is expensive. So the proposed rearmament bank, which I'm working on, is a big thing for it, is to help European countries place orders with Ukrainian defense tech companies and then finance both the production at the Ukrainian end as well as financing the contract from the government end, and then going to the Western banks and saying, this is now back, this contract's backed by a major international multilateral bank. So please facilitate it and stop playing what technically silly buggers. So I think there's enormous potential there, and I still think, despite all the trauma and suffering and appalling waste of life and destruction and so on, post-ceasefire, post-victory Ukraine is potentially going to be one of the biggest booms in Europe.
Absolutely. Edward, thank you very much indeed. And Phillips O'Brien, thank you so much. Have you got any books out at the moment we need to know about, in case?
Please subscribe to Phillips' Substack. It's absolutely brilliant. And you don't just get Phillips, you also get the brilliant Mina Allender. So you get 2 for the price of 1. If you subscribe to only 1 Substack, subscribe to Phillips. If you subscribe to 2, then also subscribe to mine.
And also read Edward's column in the Times, which is always worth a read.
Okay.
So, gentlemen, I'd like to thank you very much indeed for. Sorry, I think we could possibly have talked for a very long time about all sorts of aspects, but maybe for another time. And hopefully Edward could come back and talk about his rearmament bank that he's building. So anyone out there talking about finance and financing Ukrainian tech, please come forward. And this is the Ukraine-Britain Business Council thanking everyone for listening in. And I'm sorry we didn't answer all your questions. There's just too much to discuss. Look forward to hearing from you all. And thank you so much to Phillips O'Brien and to Edward Lucas. Thank you.